Okay, run and get your blanket and come and sit with me. Honey wants to read you a book, and it's called Ragdoll Press. This book goes with a book named Goose Eggs, which I already read a while back, and Ivy Cottage. And they're all about the little girls, they're little dolls actually, who live with Miss Biscuit. And they have animals, and they're so cute. Okay. Ruby Buttons jumped out of bed and ran to the bedroom window. It was a cold morning in January, and the glass was frosty, so Ruby rubbed a clear spot and peeped through. "It's snowing," she cried, and hurried to dress. "Violet," she said, "wake up, it's snowing." Violet Pickles slept soundly in the next bed. Ruby pulled up her stockings and fumbled with the buttons of her dress. She called again, "Wake up, Violet, you're missing the snow." Violet groaned and buried her head under the pillow. "5 more minutes," she said. "Well, I'm not going to miss a second of it." Ruby put on her coat and ran downstairs to the kitchen. Miss Biscuit was feeding Hannah and James, the pet geese, who always slept inside during the cold weather. "Good morning," said Miss Biscuit. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" "Good morning," said Ruby, opening the back door of Ivy Cottage. "I'm going to go make a snowman." When Ruby returned to the warm kitchen, Violet was sitting at the table reading a book. Miss Biscuit was talking on the telephone, so Ruby spoke to Violet in a whisper. "Look at my snowman," she said, brushing the snow off her coat and pulling off her boots. Violet turned a page. "Very nice," she muttered without looking up. "Actually, it's a snow woman," Ruby said. She hung up her coat and sat down at the table. Miss Biscuit was just saying goodbye. "That was your teacher at Fernhill School," she told Ruby and Violet. "There won't be any classes until they clear the snow." "Hurrah!" Ruby cried, smiling. Violet didn't seem to hear and said nothing until she closed her book. "The end," she said with a sigh. "I love happy endings." She unfolded her napkin and placed it carefully in her lap. "Someday I'm going to write novels just like that, and they'll all have happy endings." Violet looked at the clock. "We'd better have breakfast," she said. "We don't want to be late for school." Later that morning, Miss Biscuit began some baking, so Ruby offered to do the weekend shopping at the general store. Violet had already started a new book, but Ruby persuaded her to come along. They put on their coats and were about to leave when Hannah began to make a loud honking noise. "I think she wants to come with us," said Ruby. "She won't be any trouble." Ruby ran to get Hannah's hat and scarf while Violet took the shopping basket and went to collect the sled from the garden shed. Miss Biscuit waved and off they went. A brisk walk in the snow soon brought them to Mr. Bickerstaff's store. The bell over the door danced and jingled as they stepped inside and stamped the snow off their boots. "Good morning," said Mr. Bickerstaff. "Come in and get warm." He put down his flour ladle and tied up the sack. Ruby gave Miss Biscuit's shopping list to Mr. Bickerstaff and joined Violet and Hannah by the stove. Ruby and Violet warmed their hands by the wood stove and listened while Mr. Bickerstaff brought them up to date with all the Fernhill news. Farmer Duff had bought a new cow, and Mrs. Brown was expecting a baby in the spring. "They're hoping for a girl this time after the 3 boys," Mr. Bickerstaff told them. "Going to call her Jessie after the grandmother." "A baby in the spring," said Violet. "Imagine that. We never know what's going to go on around here." When he had finished the shopping list, Mr. Bickerstaff lifted a trap door which led down to the cellar. "I've been saving something for Hannah," he said. "Wait here, I'll be just a minute." "Can we come?" asked Ruby, eager to have a look. "All right," said Mr. Bickerstaff, "but watch your step." The cellar was large and filled with sacks of potatoes and barrels of apples and onions. Mr. Bickerstaff found an empty orange crate filled with loose straw and handed it to Ruby. "I thought this would make a good nest for Hannah." "Oh, yes," Ruby said. "It's lovely, thank you." "What's this over here?" Violet asked, pointing to a funny contraption with a crank handle. "That's a little printing press," Mr. Bickerstaff said. "I used it years ago for making up advertisements." "Does it still work?" "Oh, yes," Mr. Bickerstaff replied. "It just needs some oil. It's been sitting down here collecting dust for years. I keep meaning to get rid of it. Nobody uses these old things anymore." "I could use it," Violet said in an excited voice. "Oh, Mr. Bickerstaff, would you let me have it?" "Of course, if you really want it, but it's a bit heavy to carry. Why don't you ask Miss Biscuit? If she doesn't mind, I'll bring it out to you tomorrow." "Come on, Ruby," Violet said impatiently. "Let's go home now." Ruby picked up Hannah's new bed and hurried upstairs after Violet. Violet and Ruby packed the shopping onto their sled and headed for home. They hadn't gone far when Ruby paused for a moment. "Violet," she said in a puzzled voice, "what are you going to do with that old printing press?" "Well," began Violet, "I've got the most wonderful idea for starting my career as a writer." "Really?" said Ruby. "Oh, please tell me what it is." "If I have a printing press," Violet explained, "I can start my own newspaper." "A newspaper?" Ruby said in amazement. "Yes," said Violet, "a newspaper for children. I've got so many ideas and you can help me." "Me?" said Ruby. "Yes," Violet replied. "I'll need an assistant. What do you think?" Ruby thought for a while, then said, "I would feel very honored to work on your newspaper." "Good," said Violet. "Let's hurry home. I can't wait to tell Miss Biscuit." The snow was deep and the journey home was slow. Violet and Ruby were getting tired and pulled the sled to the side of the road for a rest. They were about to sit down when they heard someone shouting from the hillside above them. "Hello down there!" "Who's that?" said Violet. Ruby turned to look. "I think it's Skeeter," she said. "I wonder what he's doing way out here." It was Skeeter, and he waved to them. "Watch me," he shouted. "Watch me." He jumped forward and started down the steep hillside. "He shouldn't run so fast," said Ruby. "He'll crash into a tree if he's not careful." "Ruby," said Violet, "he's not running. I think he's trying to ski." They watched as their friend raced toward them. "I can't look," said Violet, covering her eyes. "Skeeter," Ruby called, "you must slow down. You're going to fall and hurt yourself." But it was too late. Skeeter suddenly lost his balance and came rolling down the hillside like a large snowball, landing with a thump in a deep snowdrift. Skeeter was sitting up when they reached him, muttering to himself and still a little dazed. "What happened?" he said. "You've had an accident," said Ruby. "Your skis are broken. Are you all right?" "I think so," said Skeeter, rubbing his head. "I didn't see that turn. I had it all worked out. I was sure I could do it this time." "It's getting dark," said Ruby. "Maybe you should walk home with us. We'll take the shortcut through Fern Hill Wood. It's not far." Violet helped Skeeter up. He could walk all right, but his arm was very bruised. Ruby picked up the broken skis. "Leave them," Skeeter said sadly. "I don't think I'll try skiing again." Ruby and Violet knew the shortcut well. Skeeter trailed along beside them as they wove in and out among the trees. A light snow was falling. It was dark and still. Then suddenly the silence was broken by a long, mournful howl. They froze in terror. "What's that?" said Ruby. "Sounds like wolves to me," replied Violet. "Let's get out of here." "There aren't any wolves in Fern Hill," said Skeeter. "Something's hurt." There was another cry. "It's over there," said Skeeter. "Follow me. We'd better go and have a look." They left the sled and followed the whimpering sounds down a steep slope and through the thicket. Moments later, they discovered a small brown and white dog, cold and frightened, with its front paw caught in an iron trap. Skeeter stepped on the catch, releasing the metal clamps, and lifted the injured paw. "Poor little thing," he said, tucking the shivering animal inside his jacket to keep warm. "She must be lost." "Could we take her home?" Ruby asked. "Maybe we can keep her. She hasn't got a collar. Let's get the sled. We can think of a name on the way back." "What about Patch?" Violet suggested. "It suits her," Skeeter said. "Yes," Ruby agreed. "Patch would be a very good name." Miss Biscuit was cooking supper when they finally reached Ivy Cottage. Ruby and Violet insisted that Skeeter should come inside so that Miss Biscuit could look at his arm, which had been hurting since his fall on the hillside. "What on earth have you done to yourself?" Miss Biscuit exclaimed when she saw the state of Skeeter's clothes. "And what have you got there?" "This is Patch," said Ruby. "Skeeter rescued her from a trap." And she told Miss Biscuit all about the skiing mishap and their adventure on Fern Hill. Miss Biscuit was certain that Skeeter had sprained his wrist, and she tore up an old sheet to make a sling for his arm. Ruby wrapped Patch's injured paw with the leftover strips of cloth. "You must stay for dinner," Miss Biscuit said to Skeeter. "I've got hot soup and a pie just ready to come out of the oven." She put an extra plate on the table. After his third bowl of soup, Skeeter began to feel much better. And after 2 pieces of apple pie, he said good night and left for home. As they cleared the table, Violet told Miss Biscuit all about the printing press. "Could I have it, please?" she asked. Miss Biscuit smiled and agreed. "But now you must both go to bed. It's been a very long day." Violet was up early the next morning to start work on her newspaper. Miss Biscuit brought an old typewriter down from the attic while Ruby began clearing out the sewing room, which was to become Violet's office. Mr. Bickerstaff arrived with the printing press. "You're very busy," he said to Violet as he put the press on the table in the corner. "I'm typing stories for my newspaper," Violet explained. "I want to have the first edition ready next week." "Well, if you need any help, just let me know," he said. "Don't work too hard." When Ruby finished dusting, she sharpened some pencils before going downstairs to look after Patch. Violet spent the rest of the afternoon working until Miss Biscuit called her for dinner, which she finished as quickly as good manners would allow. After excusing herself, Violet hurried back to the sewing room and continued typing until bedtime. The next day, Ruby and Violet went to see Skeeter. They arrived to find him dragging a ladder across the garden. "Hello," Skeeter said. "You're just in time to witness an amazing scientific experiment. Watch this." He propped the ladder against a pear tree. "What are you going to do?" asked Ruby. "Why, I'm going to fly, of course," replied Skeeter, "just like a bird." "What?" cried Violet. "Don't worry," said Skeeter. "I've worked it all out." "That's impossible," said Violet. "But I've made these wings," Skeeter explained, taking a step up the ladder. "When I get to the top of this tree and the wind is just right, I'll jump out and soar over the orchard, across the meadow, and down to the river by Fern Hill, then back again. It should take about 3 minutes. Now, I don't want you to be concerned. It's all scientific." Violet and Ruby were horrified. "Scientific," said Violet. "I've never heard of something so silly. Skeeter, come down here immediately." Skeeter paused. "Can't it wait?" he asked. "No," said Violet. "Please come down. I want to have a serious talk with you." Skeeter sighed and reluctantly started back down the ladder. Violet brushed the snow off a log by the garden fence and sat down while Ruby carried the ladder back to the house just to be safe. Skeeter sat next to Violet. Violet thought hard for a moment, then she spoke. "2 days ago you sprained your wrist rolling down a mountainside trying to ski. Now you're about to jump out of a tree with a pair of wings pretending you can fly, which everyone knows is impossible because you're not a bird or an airplane. Why do you keep doing these things? It's not like you to be so reckless." Skeeter was silent for a moment. "If I tell you," he said in a quiet voice, "will you promise not to laugh?" "I won't laugh," said Violet. "I just want to be somebody," said Skeeter. "I want people to notice me." "But Skeeter, you'll never be happy pretending to be something you're not. You're not a show-off. Besides, we like you the way you are." "You do?" Skeeter said. "Of course," Violet replied. "Miss Biscuit says good friends don't grow on trees. Now, let's find Ruby and have some tea. We've brought you a carrot cake." "What a good idea," Skeeter said. "I love carrot cake." Skeeter took off his wings and they walked back to the house. Miss Biscuit hurried to open the front door when she heard Ruby and Violet at the gate. "You'll never guess what's happened," she said in an excited voice, which was unusual for Miss Biscuit, who was normally calm about everything. "What is it?" said Ruby, stepping inside. "I can't spoil the surprise. You'll have to see for yourself. Follow me." And she walked briskly into the kitchen. Ruby couldn't believe her eyes. "Puppies," she cried. "Oh, Patch, you've had puppies. This is wonderful." "Look at this little black one," exclaimed Violet, kneeling beside the fire. Ruby was counting. There were 5 puppies altogether, and one by one Ruby and Violet held and gently stroked them. "I've just had an amazing idea," said Violet. She put the brown and white puppy back with the others. "There's a story here, and I've got to go and write it." Violet ran upstairs to her typewriter and began to work. "Goodness, look at the time," Miss Biscuit said. "I must make some lunch." Ruby offered to help. "I'm sure you would rather sit and play with the puppies," Miss Biscuit said kindly. "Besides, now you'll have to think of 5 new names." A week later, Violet took the very first edition of her newspaper to the general store, and Mr. Bickerstaff gave copies to everyone in Fern Hill. Ruby had written an article with helpful hints on pet care, and Miss Biscuit had contributed a recipe for chocolate chip cookies. The paper was a great success, and Violet was pleased, but no one was more thrilled than Skeeter. The big black headlines read, "Hero saves lives in snowstorm drama." "I'm a hero," Skeeter said, "a real-life hero." And that was the first edition of the Ragdoll Press. The end.